Berlin, 2025. Imagine waking up in a city of marble monuments and broad boulevards, where German is the only language spoken from the Atlantic to the Urals, where Greater Germania stretches across a continent reshaped by Nazi victory. This alternate reality, where Germany won World War II, has fascinated historians, novelists, and strategists for 80 years. But most depictions get it wrong. They imagine a stable Nazi empire lasting decades, perhaps centuries. They picture sleek architecture, advanced technology, and orderly fascist rule. The reality would have been far different, and far worse. This isn't a story about what if the Nazis had won and built a lasting empire. This is a story about what would have happened when that empire inevitably collapsed, and what the aftermath would look like today in 2025. Because here's what most alternate history gets wrong. Nazi Germany winning World War II wouldn't have resulted in a stable 1,000-year Reich. It would have resulted in the largest humanitarian catastrophe in human history, followed by decades of chaos, civil wars, and the eventual fragmentation of Europe into something barely recognizable. The question isn't, what if Germany won? The real question is, what would be left of Europe after Germany's victory destroyed it? This is that story, a story based not on fantasy, but on historical analysis, economic reality, and the internal contradictions of the Nazi system that would have torn it apart from within. Welcome to the nightmare that didn't happen, but could have. Before we explore the aftermath, we need to establish a plausible scenario for German victory. Not every scenario works. Some would require impossibilities, like Germany developing atomic weapons first, or the United States never entering the war. The most plausible German victory scenario involves several specific changes to actual history, all within the realm of possibility. Change 1. Britain negotiates peace, 1940 to 1941. In our scenario, the Battle of Britain ends differently, not with German victory, but with a negotiated peace. Churchill is replaced, perhaps assassinated, perhaps voted out, by a government willing to make peace with Germany. This isn't far-fetched. In actual history, powerful factions in Britain favored negotiation. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, advocated approaching Italy to mediate peace terms. King George VI had connections to Germany through family. Portions of the aristocracy were sympathetic to fascism. In our scenario, the Blitz's destruction, combined with the apparent impossibility of defeating Germany without allies, pushes Britain toward peace. The terms: Britain keeps its empire and fleet. Germany gets a free hand in Europe. Neither side attacks the other. This isn't surrender. It's a pragmatic recognition that neither side can defeat the other. Britain, like France, accepts that continental Europe is Germany's sphere. Change 2, Operation Barbarossa, succeeds 1941-1942. With Britain neutralized and no longer tying down German forces, resources, and attention, Germany launches Operation Barbarossa with greater strength. More importantly, it launches with better planning. In actual history, Barbarossa was flawed from conception. Logistics were inadequate. Objectives were unclear. Forces were divided between Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine. Winter preparations were minimal. In our scenario, Germany focuses its offensive. The target is Moscow. All available forces drive for the capital. They reach it in October 1941, before the Rasputitsa, autumn mud, and winter freeze. Moscow falls. Stalin dies in the city, killed by German bombing, by his own paranoia, or executed after capture. Soviet command structure collapses. The USSR fragments into chaos, competing generals, ethnic rebellions, and regional governments declaring independence. The Soviet Union doesn't surrender formally. It simply ceases to exist as a unified state. By summer 1942, German forces have reached the Urals. Beyond that is Siberia, which Germany has no interest in conquering or ability to control. Change 3. The United States stays out, 1941 to 1942. This is the most difficult change to justify, but it's possible. In actual history, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. Germany's declaration of war on America, a catastrophic blunder, meant the US fought in Europe. In our scenario, Japan doesn't attack Pearl Harbor. Perhaps Roosevelt's oil embargo doesn't happen. Perhaps Japan focuses on Soviet Siberia instead of Southeast Asia. Perhaps internal politics in Japan go differently. Without Pearl Harbor, American public opinion remains divided. Isolationist sentiment is strong. Roosevelt might want to enter the war, but without a direct attack, Congress won't declare war. America supplies Britain through Lend-Lease, but doesn't fight. By 1943, with Britain at peace and the USSR collapsed, there's no war in Europe for America to enter. Germany has won. The result, by 1943, Germany dominates Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. France, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark are occupied or puppet states. Eastern Europe is conquered territory, being reshaped through brutal occupation. Britain remains independent, but neutral. The Soviet Union has fragmented into dozens of competing entities, none strong enough to resist German control of European Russia. This is the victory. Now begins the nightmare. With victory secured and no external enemies to fight, Nazi Germany turns its full attention to its ideological goals. The Holocaust, which in actual history killed 6 million Jews, would have been total. In actual history, the Holocaust was constrained by war. Resources were diverted to military needs. Transportation was needed for troops. The genocide was industrialized, but still faced logistical limits. And it was interrupted. Death camps were liberated. Survivors were freed. And the full program never reached completion. In our scenario, none of these constraints exist. Germany has won. It controls all of Europe. It faces no external threat. Every resource can be devoted to ideological projects. The extermination of European Jewry. In actual 1945, approximately 3.5 million Jews remained alive in areas Germany had controlled. In our scenario, these people don't survive. The Wannsee Conference's plan for the final solution is implemented completely. Jews in every occupied territory are systematically murdered. The methods vary. Some are shipped to death camps. Some are shot in mass executions. Some are worked to death in labor camps. But the result is universal. By 1950, European Jewry, a community that had existed for 2,000 years, has been eradicated. Not reduced, not scattered, eradicated. The cultural, intellectual, and human loss is incalculable. Generalplan Ost implemented. But the genocide doesn't stop with Jews. The Nazis had always planned broader ethnic restructuring of Eastern Europe. Generalplan Ost, General Plan for the East, called for extermination of 50–65% of Poles, approximately 20 million people. Extermination of 75% of Belarusians, approximately 6 million. Extermination of 50–75% of Ukrainians, approximately 25 million. Deportation of surviving Slavs beyond the Urals. Colonization of emptied territory by German settlers. This wasn't theoretical. The plan existed, was approved by Nazi leadership, and had begun implementation in occupied territories. Only military defeat stopped it. In our scenario, without military defeat, it continues. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Over the 1940s, approximately 100 million people are murdered through systematic genocide, mass starvation, and planned depopulation. Entire regions are emptied of inhabitants. The methods are varied. Mass shootings. Special units, Einsatzgruppen, Systematically execute populations. Villages are surrounded, inhabitants are marched to prepared pits, and they're shot. This is the method used early in the war and continues in rural areas. Starvation. Food is systematically requisitioned from occupied populations. Herbert Back's hunger plan called for deliberate starvation of tens of millions. In our scenario, this plan is fully implemented. Harvests are confiscated, food distribution is restricted to Germans and racially valuable populations, and everyone else starves. Deportation. Undesirable populations are loaded onto trains and shipped east, into Siberia, into undeveloped regions, into places where survival is impossible. This is genocide through exposure and abandonment. Slave labor. Millions are worked to death in labor camps, constructing Germania's grand projects. The death rate in these camps is deliberately maximized. Workers are considered disposable, replaceable by constant influx of new slaves. Medical experimentation. Nazi doctors, no longer constrained by any authority or morality, expand their programs. Concentration camps become sites of mass medical murder disguised as research. The demographics of Eastern Europe are fundamentally altered. Poland's population drops from 35 million to perhaps 10 million. Ukraine's population drops from 40 million to perhaps 15 million. Belarus is almost entirely depopulated. German settlers move into emptied territory. The SS supervises colonization. Farms are distributed to German veterans. New towns are built with German names. The landscape itself is Germanized. Slavic place names are erased. Churches are destroyed. Local languages are forbidden. By 1950, the ethnic map of Europe has been redrawn through genocide. The logistics of genocide. The scale of murder requires massive infrastructure. More death camps are built. The rail network is devoted partly to transporting victims. Bureaucracy expands to track, categorize, and process millions of victims. Germany develops an entire industry around genocide. Companies compete for contracts to build camp infrastructure. Engineers develop more efficient killing methods. Lawyers draft legislation defining who lives and dies based on racial classifications. The genocide becomes normalized. German newspapers casually report resettlement of Eastern populations. School children are taught that Slavs are subhuman and their removal is necessary for German living space. Soldiers and SS men rotate through genocide duties as part of normal career progression. The silence. With no Allied forces to liberate the camps, no journalists to report the atrocities, and no Nuremberg trials to document the crimes, the genocide happens in relative silence. Some information leaks to neutral countries, but without graphic evidence or survivor testimony. It remains abstract to the outside world. Britain knows what's happening but has no power to stop it. America knows but has no entry point to intervene. The rest of the world watches helplessly or ignores it entirely. By 1950, the genocide is complete. The demographic catastrophe is total, and Europe has been fundamentally, irreversibly transformed through industrial-scale murder. This is the foundation of Nazi Europe. Everything that follows is built on this sea of blood. The 1950s represent Nazi Germany at its territorial maximum. The genocide is complete. Colonization of the East is underway. Opposition has been crushed. The Reich seems unassailable. But beneath the surface, contradictions are already emerging that will eventually destroy it. The territorial empire. By 1955, Greater Germany encompasses Core Reich, Germany, Austria, Western Poland, Alsace-Lorraine, Luxembourg, parts of Belgium, approximately 150 million people. Occupied Eastern territories. Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic states, most of Poland, Western Russia to the Urals, perhaps 50 million people, drastically reduced from pre-war populations. Puppet states: France, Vichy government, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Bohemia, Moravia, Czech lands, Croatia, approximately 100 million people under nominally independent but actually controlled regimes. Allied states: Italy, Spain, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, aligned with Germany, but maintaining some autonomy, approximately 120 million people. Total population under German direct or indirect control, 420 million people. Germania, the capital. Albert Speer's megalomaniacal plans for rebuilding Berlin as Germania are implemented. The city is rebuilt as a monument to Nazi power. The Volkshalle, People's Hall, is constructed, a domed building so massive that its own internal weather system creates clouds inside. It holds 180,000 people and serves as a temple to Nazi ideology. A massive triumphal arch, dwarfing the Arc de Triomphe, is built to commemorate Germany's victory. The Champs-Élysées is nothing compared to Germania's central boulevard, 5 kilometers long and 150 meters wide. The city is designed to intimidate. The architecture is deliberately oversized to make individuals feel insignificant. Everything serves propaganda purposes, demonstrating German power, technological capability, and eternal dominance. Hundreds of thousands of slave laborers die building Germania. Their deaths are meaningless to the regime. There are always more slaves. The economy. The Nazi economy of the 1950s is built on exploitation. Slave labor. Millions of Slavic slaves work in German factories, farms, and construction projects. They're worked to death and replaced by new slaves from occupied territories. This provides Germany with virtually free labor, allowing low production costs and high profits for German industrialists. Resource extraction. Occupied territories are systematically looted. Oil from the Caucasus, wheat from Ukraine, minerals from the Urals. Everything flows to Germany. The occupied regions are kept deliberately underdeveloped to prevent any industrial competition. Autarky achieved. With control of resources from the Atlantic to the Urals, Germany achieves the economic self-sufficiency, autarky, that had eluded it before the war. It no longer depends on trade with other powers. Industrial production. German industry, rebuilt after the war and supplied with unlimited slave labor and raw materials, produces massive amounts of material. Production standards aren't high. Efficiency isn't necessary when labor is free and replaceable, but quantity is impressive. German citizens enjoy prosperity built on this exploitation. Consumer goods become available. Cars, household appliances, and modern conveniences spread throughout German society. The standard of living rises dramatically for ethnic Germans. The military. With no external enemies, military spending decreases, but doesn't disappear. The Wehrmacht. Reduced from wartime strength, but still maintains large occupation forces throughout Europe. Military service remains mandatory for German men. It's part of ideological indoctrination and provides trained reserves. The SS expands dramatically. The SS becomes a state within a state, controlling concentration camps, slave labor, colonization programs, and internal security. SS membership is prestigious, and the organization attracts the ambitious and ruthless. Advanced weapons. German engineering focuses on prestige projects, jet aircraft, rockets, V-2 descendants, submarines, and early atomic research. These programs are more about prestige than military necessity, but they advance technology. The social system. Nazi social engineering creates a hierarchical society. Tier 1, Aryan Germans. Full citizens with all rights and privileges, access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. Expected to produce children for the Reich, women are encouraged to have large families through propaganda and financial incentives. Tier 2. Racially acceptable Europeans. Western Europeans, Dutch, Scandinavians, some French, who are considered Germanizable, receive some privileges. They're allowed to assimilate into German society if they prove loyalty and racial acceptability. Tier 3. Subject peoples. Southern and Western Europeans, who aren't considered Germanizable but are allowed to live. They're exploited economically, but not generally enslaved or murdered. They have limited rights and are subject to German authority. Tier 4. Slaves. Slavs, captured resistance members, and others deemed subhuman. No rights. Worked to death. Replaceable. This is the foundation of the economy. The culture. Nazi culture dominates. Education. Children are indoctrinated from birth in Nazi ideology. Schools teach racial theory, glorify German history, and prepare boys for military service and girls for motherhood. Critical thinking is discouraged. Obedience is paramount. Media. All media is state-controlled. Newspapers, radio, and the new medium of television broadcast Nazi propaganda. Entertainment serves ideological purposes. Art must conform to approved styles. No degenerate modern art. Literature is censored. Science. Science serves ideology. Racial pseudoscience is taught as fact. Research focuses on areas the regime values: weapons technology, racial studies, industrial chemistry. Pure research for knowledge's sake is discouraged unless it has obvious applications. Religion. The Reich is ambivalent about Christianity. Some Nazis want to eliminate it and replace it with neo-pagan Germanic spiritualism. Others see a domesticated Christianity as useful for social control. The compromise is a German Christian church that preaches obedience to the state while maintaining Christian rituals. Traditional Christianity is suppressed, but not completely eliminated. The illusion of stability. In the 1950s, the Reich appears stable. There are no major wars. The economy functions. The population is controlled. German citizens, enjoying prosperity, support the regime. Life seems normal if you're a German and don't think too hard about where the prosperity comes from. International visitors to Germania see impressive monuments, orderly streets, and apparent contentment. Some genuinely believe the Nazi system works, but beneath the surface, the contradictions are growing. The 1960s are when the Nazi system begins visibly failing. The contradictions, always present, become impossible to ignore. Economic problems. The slave labor economy creates fundamental inefficiencies. Problem 1. Innovation stagnates. Slave labor removes incentive for technological improvement. Why develop labor-saving machinery when labor is free? German industry, initially impressive in quantity, falls behind in quality. Products are crude compared to what could be produced. The Soviet Union faced similar problems in actual history. Planned economies can produce quantity, but struggle with innovation. Nazi Germany has these problems multiplied by reliance on slave labor that has zero incentive to work efficiently. Problem 2. Demographics. The genocide created a long-term demographic crisis. Millions of working-age people were murdered. The population that remains is traumatized, unproductive, and seething with resentment. The territories that should be productive, Ukraine, Poland, are depopulated wastelands. German birth rates are high in the 1950s, but begin declining in the 1960s. As prosperity increases, German women, despite propaganda, have fewer children. The regime needs population but can't force women to reproduce at replacement rates. Problem 3. Resource depletion. The exploitation model is unsustainable. Agricultural land in the East is overworked and degrading. Mines are depleted. The territories have been so thoroughly looted that there's less to extract each year. The Reich begins facing the reality that conquest isn't a sustainable economic model. Without new territories to exploit, the economy stagnates. Occupied territories. Resistance. Despite brutal occupation, resistance never fully dies. The underground. In every occupied country, resistance movements persist. They're small, constantly hunted, and brutally suppressed, but they exist. They publish underground newspapers, shelter escaped slaves, and occasionally sabotage German installations. The Polish resistance. Poland, almost entirely depopulated, but not quite destroyed, becomes a symbol. The Polish government in exile, perhaps in Britain or America, continues to exist. Polish resistance fighters, though few in number, conduct guerrilla operations. Every attack is met with savage reprisals, but the resistance continues. Slavic partisans. In the forests and mountains of Eastern Europe, Slavic partisan bands survive. They're remnants of the genocide, fugitives who escaped the death camps, former Soviet soldiers who never surrendered. They live as outlaws, raiding German settlements and representing continued defiance. Intellectual resistance. Even within Germany, some resist. A tiny, careful underground of intellectuals, religious leaders, and former military officers who opposed the Nazi system operates in secret. They can't act openly, but they preserve banned books, maintain forbidden knowledge, and wait for opportunities. The resistance is too weak to threaten the regime militarily, but it prevents the regime from achieving total control. The occupation requires constant enforcement, constant vigilance, and constant violence. This is expensive and exhausting. Internal SS-Wehrmacht rivalry. The SS and Wehrmacht, competing power centers, increasingly conflict. The Wehrmacht represents traditional military values, professionalism, efficiency, and at least nominal adherence to military codes. Many Wehrmacht officers are uncomfortable with genocide and find SS methods distasteful, though most participated or enabled them. The SS represents ideological fanaticism. SS officers are true believers in Nazi racial ideology. They consider the Wehrmacht officers soft, bourgeois, and insufficiently committed to the cause. By the 1960s, this rivalry becomes dangerous. The SS controls vast economic resources through slave labor and concentration camps. The Wehrmacht controls military force. Each suspects the other of plotting to seize total power. Hitler, aging in the 1960s, he'd be in his 70s, is less able to balance these factions. Succession becomes a looming question. Who replaces Hitler? An SS leader? A Wehrmacht general? The uncertainty creates instability. The Spanish example. Spain, under Franco, allied with Germany, begins liberalizing in the 1960s. Franco, never as ideologically extreme as Hitler, allows limited economic reforms and gradual political opening. Spain's economy begins growing as it integrates with the non-German world economy. This example is dangerous. It suggests that fascist states can reform, that totalitarianism isn't permanent, that another path is possible. German hardliners view Spain with suspicion. Spanish success makes German stagnation more obvious by comparison. Generational change. By the 1960s, a new generation has come of age. These young Germans were born during or after the war. They've known nothing but Nazi rule. Some are true believers, indoctrinated completely. But others begin questioning. Universities, even controlled ones, create spaces where ideas spread. Some students begin reading banned books, smuggled from abroad or preserved by underground networks. They begin asking dangerous questions. Why is the economy stagnating? Why do we need so many slaves? What happened to all the people who used to live in the East? This generation gap is small at first. Most young Germans support the regime, but it's growing. The youth of the 1960s are less traumatized by war memories, less grateful for peace and prosperity, and more aware of the regime's failures. Technological lag. By the late 1960s, it's becoming clear that Germany is falling behind technologically. In the actual timeline, the 1960s saw massive technological advancement: transistors, early computers, satellite communications, plastics, and medical breakthroughs. Much of this came from free exchange of ideas, international scientific cooperation, and competitive innovation. Nazi Germany, isolated and ideologically rigid, misses much of this. German science is impressive in areas the regime prioritizes: rockets, military technology, but backwards in areas it doesn't: computing, medicine, consumer technology. Televisions and radios in Germany in 1970 are less advanced than those in America or Britain. Medical care, despite German propaganda about Aryan health, is actually inferior to Western standards. Consumer goods are crude and utilitarian. Germans who've seen smuggled Western products or propaganda realize they're falling behind. The regime's claims of superiority ring increasingly hollow. The 1970s and early 1980s see the Nazi system enter terminal crisis. Hitler, born in 1889, dies in the mid-1970s. In actual history, he would have been 86 in 1975. In our scenario, he might live slightly longer with good medical care, but not much longer. By 75, he's elderly, possibly senile, and certainly no longer capable of active leadership. His death creates a succession crisis. Who rules Greater Germania? The succession battle. Multiple factions compete. The SS candidate, Heinrich Himmler, if still alive, he'd be 75 in 1975, or a protege. The SS wants one of their own, a true ideological believer who'll continue racial policies and maintain SS power. The Wehrmacht candidate, a general, preferably one with combat credentials and respect from the military. The Wehrmacht wants someone who'll reduce SS power and run the state more rationally. The party candidate, a Nazi party functionary, someone who's risen through civilian party ranks. This faction wants to maintain party dominance over both SS and military. The reformer, a dark horse candidate who suggests that Germany needs to reform, liberalize economically, and reduce terror. This faction is small, but exists. The succession is messy. There might be a brief period of collective leadership that quickly breaks down. Power struggles occur behind the scenes and occasionally break into violence. A coup might be attempted and fail. Eventually, someone emerges as Führer, but weakened and lacking Hitler's authority. Let's say the SS candidate wins through ruthlessness and control of security apparatus. The new Führer is a hardliner, committed to ideological purity. This is the worst outcome. It delays reform and accelerates collapse. Economic crisis. By the late 1970s, the economy is in serious trouble. Slave labor inefficiency. The slave economy, always inefficient, reaches a breaking point. Slave populations, worked to death for decades, are diminishing. Birth rates among slave populations are very low due to malnutrition, disease, and deliberate family separation. There aren't enough new slaves to replace those who die. German industry needs more labor, but can't get it. Production falls. Factories close. Unemployment among Germans begins rising, unthinkable in the prosperity of the 1950s. Budget crisis. The Reich's budget is increasingly strained. Military spending remains high, Occupation isn't cheap. Maintaining the vast bureaucracy is expensive. Prestige projects, Germania construction, space program, advanced weapons, consume resources. But revenue is falling. The occupied territories produce less. Tax collection is difficult in traumatized, depopulated regions. The economy is contracting. The regime tries to solve this by printing money. Inflation begins. Prices rise. The prosperity Germans enjoyed in the 1950s-60s evaporates. By 1980, living standards are falling. Food shortages. Agricultural production in the East, never recovered from depopulation and warfare, fails to feed the Reich. Germany imports food from Spain and South America, but imports require hard currency, which is scarce. Rationing is reintroduced, shocking for Germans who've known abundance. Lines for food appear. Black markets flourish. The regime that promised prosperity can't deliver basic necessities. Unrest in occupied territories. Economic crisis emboldens resistance. Open rebellion. In 1978, a major uprising occurs in Ukraine. Guerrillas seize several towns. The Wehrmacht has to deploy divisions to suppress it. The rebellion is crushed, but it demonstrates that German control is fragile. Work slowdowns. Slaves in factories begin subtle resistance, working slowly, sabotaging equipment, feigning illness. They realize the regime needs their labor, which gives them minimal leverage. Production falls further. Urban unrest. In cities like Warsaw, Prague, and Kiev, riots break out over food shortages. German troops fire on protesters. Hundreds die. But the riots keep happening. Military doubts. Wehrmacht officers, facing increasing deployment to suppress rebellions, begin questioning the system. Young officers, born after the war, didn't fight in the great victories. To them, the Wehrmacht is a glorified police force, shooting starving civilians and hunting partisans in forests. This isn't the glorious military service they were promised. Senior officers see the deteriorating situation. They understand the economy is failing. They worry about German security in a collapsing empire. Some begin discussing, very carefully, very secretly, whether the system can be reformed or whether more drastic measures are necessary. International pressure. The outside world, particularly America and Britain, begins exerting pressure. Radio Free Europe. Western broadcasts reach into German-controlled territory. They report on conditions, provide news the German media doesn't cover, and offer alternative perspectives. The regime tries to jam broadcasts and punishes listeners, but information spreads. Economic sanctions. Britain and America, seeing German weakness, impose economic sanctions. They refuse to trade with Germany, freezing German assets abroad and prohibiting technology exports. This hurts Germany more than the West. Germany needs Western technology, and trade, more than the West, needs German markets. Isolation accelerates German economic decline. Diplomatic isolation. Germany has few genuine allies. Italy is ambivalent. Spain is drifting away. Japan, in the Pacific, is uninterested in European affairs. Germany stands alone against a world that hates it. The reactionary response. Instead of reforming, the regime doubles down. Increased terror. The SS intensifies surveillance and repression. More people are arrested for defeatism or spreading rumors. Executions increase. The regime tries to control dissent through fear. Ideological campaigns. The regime launches propaganda campaigns blaming problems on saboteurs, foreign agents, and racial enemies. It claims that any remaining non-Germans are causing the problems and intensifies persecution. Resource wars. Germany attempts to solve resource shortages by seizing remaining resources. it intensifies exploitation of occupied territories, leading to more deaths and more resistance. These measures fail. Terror can't solve economic collapse. Propaganda can't create food. Resource extraction can't work in depopulated wastelands. By 1985, the Nazi state is visibly failing. The question is no longer if it will collapse, but when and how. The collapse, when it comes, is rapid and violent. The trigger event, 1987. Multiple factors converge to create a crisis. A harsh winter causes food shortages to become famine. Hundreds of thousands in German cities face starvation. The regime can't feed its own people. Simultaneously, a major rebellion erupts in Poland. Unlike previous uprisings, this one succeeds in holding territory. Polish rebels, armed with weapons smuggled from Britain and America, establish a liberated zone. The Wehrmacht is sent to crush the rebellion, but faces setbacks. German troops, demoralized and underfed themselves, don't fight with the determination of earlier generations. Some units refuse orders. Discipline is breaking down. In Germania, workers strike, illegal and unthinkable, but happening. They demand food, better conditions, and political reforms. The SS attempts to arrest strike leaders, but the strikes spread. The regime faces simultaneous military, economic, and political crisis. It's overwhelmed. The split. The Wehrmacht and SS, barely cooperating before, now openly conflict. Senior Wehrmacht generals conclude the regime is leading Germany to destruction. They begin planning a coup. The goal isn't to end Nazism, most generals are still Nazis by ideology, but to save Germany by instituting reforms, making peace with occupied populations, and restoring order. The SS leadership learns of the plot. They prepare to arrest the generals, but many Wehrmacht units are loyal to their commanders, not to the SS. In November 1987, the Wehrmacht makes its move. Elite units seize control of Germania. They arrest the Führer, the SS hardliner who'd succeeded Hitler, and declare military rule. They announce emergency reforms. But the SS doesn't accept this. SS divisions counterattack. Fighting breaks out in Germania. Tanks battle in the streets of the capital. Buildings burn. Thousands die. This is the beginning of the German Civil War. The Civil War, 1987 to 1990. The war isn't neatly divided. Multiple factions emerge. Wehrmacht, faction, controls the military and most of Germany proper, wants to maintain German dominance but institute rational reforms, willing to negotiate partial autonomy for occupied territories to restore order. SS faction controls concentration camps, slave labor systems, and significant military forces, refuses any compromise on ideology, wants to eliminate traitors and maintain racial empire at any cost. Occupied territory rebellions, Poland, Ukraine, Baltic states, and others see the German conflict as opportunity. They rebel en masse, attacking German settlers and collaborators. These rebellions are genocidal in reverse. Decades of oppression unleash revenge. Regional breakaways, various occupied territories, and even parts of Germany itself declare independence. Commanders of local garrison refuse orders from either Wehrmacht or SS, setting up personal fiefdoms. The war is brutal. In Germania, fighting destroys much of Speer's monumental architecture. The Volkshalle is damaged by artillery. The city becomes a ruined battleground. In occupied territories, violence is unrestrained. German settlers, who'd moved to seized land in the 1940s-60s, face revenge from surviving locals. Millions flee west. Many are killed. This is ethnic cleansing of Germans, horrific but understandable given what Germans had done. The Wehrmacht faction, focused on fighting the SS, can't prevent the rebellions. German forces evacuate from eastern territories, bringing waves of German refugees. The SS faction fights desperately, but loses ground. By 1989, the Wehrmacht faction controls most of Germany proper and is negotiating with Wehrmacht units that had sided with the SS. In 1990, the last major SS stronghold falls. Remaining SS leaders flee to Spain or South America, where fascist sympathizers shelter them. The Wehrmacht faction wins the civil war, but victory is Pyrrhic. Germany has been destroyed in the fighting. The aftermath, 1990-1995. Germany in 1990 is unrecognizable. Territory lost. All occupied territories have broken away. Poland, Ukraine, Baltic states, Belarus, all independent or being absorbed by neighbors. Germany controls only pre-1938 borders, maybe less. Population crisis. Millions have died in the Civil War and famines. Millions more are refugees. Germans fleeing ethnic cleansing in the East, Slavs fleeing German control, and internal refugees displaced by fighting. Economic collapse. The economy has collapsed completely. Currency is worthless. Barter replaces money. Infrastructure is destroyed. Factories are looted or bombed. Germany's standard of living has regressed to 19th century levels. Political chaos. The Wehrmacht faction establishes a military government, but it's weak and contested. Various German states consider independence. Bavaria might separate. Austria might reunify with Austria. Regional identities reassert. International response. The world is horrified, but also vengeful. Britain and America refuse aid. You made this bed, sleep in it. No Marshall Plan for Nazi Germany. Eastern European states demand reparations that Germany can't pay. Famine. Without slave labor, without access to Eastern resources, and with agriculture disrupted by war, Germany faces famine in 1990-92. Millions starve. International aid trickles in eventually, not to help Germany, but to prevent refugee waves and disease epidemics from spreading. Truth and reconciliation. As German control collapses, the full scope of the genocide becomes known. Mass graves are discovered. Survivors testify. The world learns the details of what happened in the 1940s, 50s. Some Germans claim they didn't know. Most did know, but didn't care or justified it. Now, facing judgment and living in ruins, Germans must confront what their regime did. War crimes trials begin, but they're limited. So many participated that prosecuting everyone is impossible. Trials focus on top leaders who survived. Many commit suicide. Others flee. Justice is incomplete. The new European order. By 1995, Europe has been completely reordered. Independent Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic states, and others are independent. They're damaged, traumatized, and demographically devastated, but free. Their populations are much smaller than pre-war, but they're rebuilding. Germany fragmented. Germany might split into multiple states, north-south divide, or even more fragmented. Economic crisis and regional resentments tear at unity. The German nation that Hitler tried to build is falling apart. Western Europe. France, Belgium, Netherlands emerge from German control. Their populations are traumatized by decades of occupation. They're rabidly anti-German. The idea of European unity is toxic. Why would they unite with Germans? Soviet successor states. The USSR, which collapsed in our scenario in 1942, never reformed. The territory is divided into many states: Russia proper, Siberia, Central Asian states, Caucasus republics. These states are backward, isolated, and some are controlled by warlords. Now we reach 2025 in our alternate timeline. What does Europe look like 80 years after German victory, and 30 years after its collapse. Germany. Germany in 2025 is a shadow of what it was. Population: perhaps 50-60 million, down from 80+ million in the 1960s due to war, famine, and immigration. Territory: Germany controls roughly pre-1914 borders. It's possibly divided into 2 or 3 states that are loosely confederated. Economy: Germany is poor by European standards. GDP per capita is perhaps 40% of Britain's or America's. Industry exists, but is outdated. Much of the country is still recovering from the 1990s collapse. Society: German society is deeply traumatized. There's a generation gap between those who lived under the Nazi regime, now elderly, those who fought in the Civil War, middle-aged, and those born after, young adults. Political culture is diverse. Some want to restore German greatness. Neo-Nazi movements exist. Some are pacifist, rejecting all militarism. Some want European integration despite others' hostility. German society is divided, bitter, and still arguing about the past. Reparations: Germany owes massive reparations to Eastern European states, but can't pay them. This creates ongoing international tension. Some argue debts should be forgiven to allow German recovery. Others insist Germans must pay for genocide. Poland. Poland has perhaps the most remarkable story. Population: 15 to 20 million, compared to 35 million pre-war. The population loss is permanent. Genocide killed millions, and birth rates never recovered. Territory: Poland controls roughly historical Polish lands, perhaps slightly enlarged by absorbing areas depopulated during German occupation. Economy: Poland is developing, but starting from almost nothing. The country was depopulated and deindustrialized. It's been rebuilding for 30 years, but still has decades to go. Society: Poland is deeply scarred. Almost every family lost members in the genocide. Holocaust memorials are everywhere. Polish national identity is defined by survival and resistance. Poland is rabidly anti-German. Any German attempt at reconciliation is rejected. Poles want justice, reparations, and guarantees Germany can never threaten them again. International alignment: Poland aligns closely with Britain and America, seeking protection against any German resurgence. There's discussion of a permanent British military presence in Poland. Ukraine. Ukraine's story is similar, but more complex. Population: 20 to 25 million, from 40 million pre-war. Massive population loss from genocide. Territory: Ukraine controls most of historical Ukraine, but borders are disputed with Russian successor states and Poland. Economy: severely underdeveloped. Agriculture is recovering, but industry barely exists. Ukraine is very poor, comparable to the poorest countries in the actual timeline. Political situation: Ukraine is unstable. Competing factions argue about governance. There's tension between Western-oriented reformers and those who want authoritarian stability. Regional divisions, East-West, create ongoing conflict. Russian relations: relationship with Russian successor states, Russia, Belarus, others, is complicated. Shared history, but also competition and border disputes. Belarus. Belarus might not exist as independent state. Its population was so devastated by genocide that the territory might be divided between Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. If it exists, it's tiny, 2 to 3 million people, and extremely poor. Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are independent, but tiny and impoverished. Combined population might be 314 million, down from 6 million pre-war. They're closely aligned with Scandinavia and Britain, seeking protection and development assistance. Russia. never having been unified under Soviet rule in this timeline, is fragmented. Western Russia, a state controlling roughly the Moscow region and European Russia. Population 60–80 million. Politically unstable, economically backward, might be quasi-democratic, might be authoritarian. Relations with the West are complicated. Siberia, possibly independent or loosely connected to Western Russia, rich in resources, but underdeveloped and sparsely populated. Central Asia, multiple independent states, probably authoritarian, relatively isolated from European affairs. Caucasus, independent states, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, others. Resource-rich, but politically unstable. Russian successor states are much weaker than the actual Soviet Union was. They're not superpowers. They're developing nations struggling with governance and modernization. Western Europe, France, independent since German collapse. Population 50–55 million, lower than actual timeline due to occupation effects. France is moderate prosperous, but traumatized by occupation. Deeply anti-German. French politics are complicated, competing visions of what France should be. Britain, the one major power that maintained independence. Britain in this timeline is more powerful relatively than in actual history because it avoided WWII damage and maintained its empire longer. Britain is the guarantor of Eastern European security and the dominant European power. Spain. Franco's regime transitioned to democracy in the 1980s, similar to actual timeline. Spain is relatively prosperous and is the mediator between Germany and the rest of Europe. Italy. Complex history, was aligned with Germany, but that alliance collapsed in the 1970s. Italy is democratic now, but dealing with its fascist past. Scandinavia. Neutral during German dominance, now thriving. Sweden, Norway, Denmark are prosperous and stable. They provide aid to Baltic states and maintain distance from German affairs. International relations. No European Union. The idea of European unity is toxic. Too much history, too much resentment. Trade happens, but there's no political integration. Each nation jealously guards sovereignty. British hegemony. Britain is the dominant European power. British military bases in Eastern Europe guarantee security. Britain mediates disputes. British economic aid supports rebuilding. American influence. America is involved, but less so than in actual timeline. No NATO. America has bilateral defense agreements with Britain and some Eastern European states, but isn't as committed to Europe. German isolation. Germany is isolated, mistrusted, and weak. No one wants to work with Germans. German products are boycotted in much of Europe. Germans face discrimination when traveling abroad. Germany is treated as a pariah state. Ongoing conflicts. Border disputes are common. Resource conflicts occur. Ethnic tensions remain high. Europe is more violent and unstable than actual 2125. Technology and development. Uneven development. Western Europe, Britain, Scandinavia, France, Spain, is relatively advanced, comparable to actual 2025, though perhaps slightly behind. Eastern Europe is much less developed, comparable to actual 1980s or 1990s in many areas. Infrastructure is poor. Internet penetration is low. Technology is dated. Germany is somewhere in between, has industrial capacity, but it's outdated. Technology sector barely exists. Brain drain. Talented people from Eastern Europe and Germany emigrate to Britain, America, or Western Europe. This hinders development in poorer regions, but can't be stopped. Medical lag. Medical technology is generally behind actual 2025 levels, particularly in poorer regions. life expectancy is lower. Diseases that were conquered in actual timelines still exist here. Culture and memory. Memory of genocide. The genocide is remembered differently in different places. In Eastern Europe, central to national identity. Holocaust memorials everywhere. Education focuses heavily on genocide. Annual remembrance days are major events. In Germany, contested. Some Germans accept responsibility and support education about genocide. Others are defensive, tired of being blamed, or deny the extent of crimes. German society is deeply divided on how to remember this past. In Western Europe, acknowledged, but not as central to identity, since Western Europeans weren't victims. There's compassion, but also distance. Diaspora communities. Jewish diaspora, those who fled before genocide was completed, maintained strong communities abroad. There's essentially no Jewish population in Europe anymore. The cultural loss is incalculable. Slavic diaspora communities exist in Britain, America, and elsewhere, descendants of those who escaped or were displaced. German diaspora exists in South America and elsewhere, descendants of those who fled the Civil War and collapse. Art and literature. European literature and art is dominated by themes of genocide, survival, trauma, and loss. Many major works deal with the alternate WWII, the genocide, or its aftermath. Political movements. Neo-Nazi movements exist in Germany, but are small and widely condemned. Most Germans reject Nazism entirely. Anti-German sentiment is strong in Eastern Europe, sometimes crossing into xenophobia. Moderate voices call for reconciliation, but face resistance. Can Germany ever be rehabilitated? Will Europe ever unite? Can the demographic losses be recovered? How long until the trauma fades? These questions remain unanswered in 2025. Europe is still dealing with the consequences of German victory 80 years earlier. What does this alternate history teach us? Lesson 1. Evil systems are unstable. The Nazi regime, had it won, wouldn't have lasted. Its internal contradictions, slave economy, genocide as policy, ideological rigidity, militarism, would have destroyed it. Evil isn't sustainable. Systems built on oppression contain the seeds of their own destruction. The 1,000-year Reich was delusional. In our scenario, it lasted perhaps 40 to 50 years before collapsing. A longer version of the actual Nazi regime, which lasted only 12 years. Lesson 2. Genocide has permanent consequences. The demographic devastation in our scenario is permanent. Populations don't recover from 50 to 70% losses. The cultures, languages, and knowledge destroyed can never be fully restored. Even 80 years later in our scenario, Eastern Europe hasn't recovered. This illustrates why preventing genocide matters, not just morally, but practically. The damage is irreversible. Lesson 3. Victory matters. Our actual timeline, for all its problems, is infinitely better than this scenario. The Allied victory in WWII prevented this nightmare. Yes, the Cold War happened. Yes, there were problems. But compared to this alternate history, our timeline is paradise. This validates the sacrifices made to defeat Nazism. Every soldier who died, every civilian who suffered, every nation that fought, all contributed to preventing this outcome. Lesson 4. Systems built on lies fail. Nazi ideology was built on false premises: racial superiority, spirit over materiel, the sustainability of conquest. These lies couldn't sustain a functioning state. Reality eventually intrudes. This suggests that authoritarian systems built on ideological falsehoods will eventually fail, though the process can take decades and cause immense suffering. Lesson 5. Historical contingency. This alternate history required several specific changes to actual history. If any had gone differently, Germany still would have lost. Britain not making peace, Moscow not falling, America entering the war. Any of these maintains Allied victory. This suggests history wasn't predetermined to end as it did, but there were many points where things could have gone worse. We're fortunate they didn't. Lesson 6. The long shadow of atrocity. In our scenario, Europe in 2025 is still dealing with events from the 1940s. Genocide casts a shadow that extends generations. This is true in our actual timeline too. Holocaust survivors and their descendants still deal with trauma, and European relations are still shaped by WWII. This suggests we should take seriously the long-term consequences of violence and work to prevent conflicts whose effects will last generations. This alternate history is speculation, but it's informed speculation based on historical analysis of Nazi plans and intentions, understanding of how oppressive systems function and fail, economic analysis of sustainability, or lack thereof, of conquest-based economies, demographic studies of genocide effects, comparative history of empire collapse. It's not certain this is exactly how things would have gone. Maybe the Nazi regime would have reformed earlier. Maybe it would have lasted longer. Maybe the collapse would have been more or less violent. But the broad outlines, initial appearance of stability, hidden contradictions, economic decline, eventual collapse, and long-term devastation seem likely based on historical patterns. Our actual 2025, for all its problems, is so much better than this scenario. We live in a world where genocide is condemned and prosecuted, imperfectly, but the principle exists. We live in a world where European nations cooperate through the EU. We live in a world where democracy, though challenged, is still the aspirational system. We live in a world that learned from WWII and tried, imperfectly, to prevent repetition. This alternate history helps us appreciate that. It shows us how much worse things could have been. It reminds us why fighting fascism mattered and still matters. The Europe of 2025 in our scenario, divided, traumatized, impoverished, and haunted by genocide, is a cautionary tale. It shows that military victory isn't enough to sustain evil systems. But it also shows that allowing evil systems to win, even briefly, causes damage that echoes for generations. The lesson: fight fascism early. Don't let it win, because even its eventual failure will destroy everything it touches. We live in the better timeline. Let's keep it that way.